Masechet Sotah Daf Mem Gimel. We left off on the speech that the Kohen Mashuach Milchama would say to the troops when they went out to war, and we saw how they said that do not be afraid, Hashem is on your side. And now we're continuing with the next Mishnah of what the Shoterim, the officers, would go and tell the people, the troops. And the Shoterim talk about the three exemptions for different milestones, plus yet another exemption in the next paragraph for Yasefua Shoterim, anyone who is afraid. So we're going to ask several questions. Who exactly does this apply to? It says a new house. What if a person builds a new shed or a warehouse? He makes a kedem. Only a vineyard? What if he planted something else? He married because he did kiddushin. Kiddushin. What if it was a prohibited kiddushin? Right. So there's all kinds of subcases that we want to know when exactly does the exemption from war apply. So here we say Echad boneh bet hateven, bet habakar, bet ha'isim, bet ha'osarot. Echad boneh ve'echad haloker ve'echad hayoresh ve'echad shenitan lo matana. Whether you build a barn or a silo or a barn or a woodshed or a warehouse, all of these things are called bayit in some way. So when it says bayit, it's not just the main house that you live in. Anything that's called a house, and these are all bet something, and it doesn't matter if you built it. Doesn't mean you have to actually sit and build it by hand. Whether you bought it or inherited it or you got it as a gift. In all those cases, there's a new house type of structure that came into your possession, and you did not yet get a chance to live in it. To live in it means for 1 year. That first year, this law applies, and the person is exempt. Next category, person planted a vineyard, this is for a vineyard or fruit trees are prohibited for use for the first 4 years. 3 years, cannot use them at all. 4th year, it's revai. You have to go and eat it in Jerusalem or redeem it. So that's the chilelo. So this one applies to all those 3+ years. A person who planted a new vineyard and didn't get to use the new fruits for those 3 to 4 years is exempt. Now, and this applies not only to a vineyard, but any fruit trees, as long as there are 5 fruit trees. It has to be to 5 fruit trees, then it's already considered an orchard as something significant. Don't get an exemption just for 1 to 4 fruit trees. And even if the 5 are of all different species, that's okay. If there are 5 and they're together, that's an orchard, and that's worthy of being a milestone. You're exempt from war until the 4th year when you bring the revai. Echad hanotea, echad hamavrich, ve'echad hamarki, ve'echad halokeach, ve'echad hayoresh, ve'echad shenitan lo matana. And this applies not only to someone who actually plants from a seed to begin with, also to someone who layers or grafts. You take a branch of a tree, as in this picture here, and you bend it down into the ground, and then you leave it for a while, and since it's in the ground, it starts sprouting a whole new tree. And it grows its own roots. So even though this is not planting a tree from a new seed, it's just an extension of this host tree. Nevertheless, this becomes its own entity, and one is exempt from going to war while this new tree is growing. And the same is true of grafting. You take a branch from one tree and put it onto a host tree, and then it's going to grow some new fruit from that. That also is a cause for exemption. And the Gemara will explain the reason why and exactly what case we're talking about. Generally, grafting is prohibited if it's 2 different species, but it's permitted if it's the same species. Gemara will say that this is talking about when you're grafting with the same species. Now, also, even if you didn't plant the vineyard or the trees, but you bought them, or you inherited them, or you were given them as a present, also the exemption applies until you get a chance to enjoy their fruits. מי האיש אשר ארס אישה וגומר? אחד המארס את הבתולה ואחד המארס את האלמנה, ואפילו שומרת יבם, אפילו שמת אחי במלחמה, חוזר ובא לו. This exemption applies if someone did kiddushin. We're talking about kiddushin only, and they didn't yet do nisuin, right? Often this would be months apart, not like today when we do it back-to-back. So you did kiddushin, and it doesn't matter if the kiddushin was with a betula, or if she had been married already, and she is widowed, and she is an almana, or even if this is a shomeret yavam. He didn't do kiddushin at all, just to have this guy. His brother died, and now he has an obligation to do yibum with his sister-in-law. That is similar to kiddushin, and he didn't yet do yibum. So in all those cases, he is exempt from war. Even if he just heard that his brother died in the war, he comes back. It's the middle of the war, and maybe they're both fighting in the war, and one dies and he has no children. The other brother comes back from the war because he is now awaiting doing a full marriage through Yibum. כל אלו ואלו שומעים דברי הכהן מערכי המלחמה וחוזרים ומספקים מים ומזון ומתקנים את הדרכים. All of the people on this list, they have to go to the battlefield, to the border. They have to show up, and then they have to listen to the Kohen. It's weird that it says Kohen, because we just said that it's the Shotrim that say this. Gemara will explain that actually the Kohen and the Shotrim both say this. So they have to go there, they have to listen to the speech of the Kohen, and who tells them the laws of war, and who's allowed to go back. And then once they hear their category, then they are allowed to return. Now, when they return home, they don't sit and do nothing. They help out the war effort. They provide water and food, and they fix up the roads so that the troops can go and be successful. After all, they're just waiting to do these things. They're waiting to get married. They're not married yet. And so they should keep busy by doing all these other things. Now, ve'elu she'enan hozrin. The following, the exemption does not apply to. They have to go to war. Why? Haboneh bet sha'ar achsadra mirpeset. Someone builds a gateway, or a veranda, or a balcony. A veranda here is talking about like this, a covered porch. This is not called a bayit. Nobody lives in a veranda. And so, or a gateway, or a balcony. These are not considered houses, and that's so you might be excited about it, but it's not the same as same milestone as a house or warehouse or anything that's called a house. If you planted 4 or less fruit trees, that's not sufficient. That's not enough of a milestone. If you planted 5 or more non-fruit bearing trees, even 100, if they're not fruit bearing, then this whole thing doesn't apply. This is talking about the enjoyment of getting to plant the fruit, to eat the fruit. That's what a person is looking forward to. All of these exceptions, exemptions from war show the Torah's care about the great milestones of life that people look forward to. They look forward to the day they get married, the day you build and enter a house, or when you invest a lot of work into a field and you want to enjoy those fruits or those grapes. Right? This is the essence of what life is about. And so that would be just a terrible shame for someone to die while waiting and not be able to experience these amazing life experiences. Okay, so it just shows the great values of the Torah. Hamachazir et gerushato, someone who remarries his original wife. They got divorced and he marries the same wife again, of course with nobody in between, and he's not a Kohen. So this is not as happy as a first wedding, right? Where during the times of the Omed, actually one is permitted to machazir girushato during all the days of the Omed, because again, it's not as happy as a first wedding. It is happy, it's a good thing, but it's not quite on the same level. Happens to be the first couple that I ever performed the marriage for got divorced and then got remarried, and I performed the wedding second time for the same couple. It was happy, but of course not. It's a re-happiness. but not worthy of exemption because they already lived together for a year. So they already had that experience of living together. That they don't have to wait. Almana lekohen gadol, gerusha v'chalusa lekohen hejot, mamzeret untina l'Yisrael bat Yisrael mamzeru natin lo haya chozer. Any prohibited marriage is not a reason for exemption from war. So if an almana marries a kohen gadol marries a widow, or a regular kohen marries a gerusha or chalutza, or a woman who's a mamzeret unitina marries a regular Jew, or a regular Jewish man, a kosher Jewish man, a woman marries a mamzer or natin man. Natin is a Gibeonites. They're not allowed to marry into the general public of the Jewish people. So since all these marriages are prohibited, even though the marriage goes through, it's a valid marriage, but it's a prohibited marriage, so they don't get exemptions. Rabbi Yehuda adds, similar to Machazi Gerushato, if someone has a house at a certain place, it falls down, and he rebuilds the house, the same house, on the same spot, so while he's happy that he's able to rebuild his house, it's not the same. He already lived there in that spot, in a similar house, and so that's not happy enough. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Afa Boneh Bet Levenim Besharon Lo Haya Chozer. Rabbi Eliezer adds, if someone builds a brick house in Sharon, this is the plain area near Yafo, where the houses are not stable. The clay that's used there is soft, the ground is soft, and then so people know they build a house, but it's only temporary, so they don't invest too much in the house, and they know that it's probably going to fall after a certain amount of time. Since it's a bit more of a temporary home, one does not get an exemption. Now, the following is yet another category. They don't have to leave their home at all. They don't even have to go to the border to hear the announcement and to go home. So unlike the first category, this is bana bait v'chanacho. If someone built a house and already started living in it, it's not how long, just for one day? No, for 1 year. He gets 1 year of living in his home. And so what we said before, that they announce you can go home, that's only someone who built a house and didn't even move in yet. Then he can go. Then he has to go to the border and he can go home. But if he already moved in within the first year of living there, that's what he's enjoying. He doesn't go at all. If he planted a vineyard and he redeemed it and he started using the fruits, he gets 1 year of fruit usage to enjoy. That's considered a substantial amount of enjoyment, and he doesn't have to even go to the battlefield at all. And similar, if he actually got married, he did nisuin, so he has to be with his wife for 1 year. He does yibum, he can live with his yavama for 1 year. As the pasuk says, that he shall be free for his house for 1 year to cheer his wife, whom he has taken. So you see, the pasuk says explicitly that he's exempt from battle and exempt even from going to the battlefield to hear the speech. Lebeto, ze beto, yeh ze karmo, v'seimach et ishto, zo ishto, asher lakach lavi et yevimto. And deriving something from each word in that pasuk, it applies not only to marriage, but also to a home, because it says lebeto. Beto, it means a home or household. In the original context, it could be just his wife. In Aramaic, debitu, of the house, that's how you say wife. Okay, but here, since it does say beto, it's true for beto. The extra word yihye is referring to a vineyard. He has to enjoy his vineyard for 1 year. And he has to cheer his wife, that's the wife. Asher lakach, that extra word, comes to include the yevama. In all these cases, does not even go out to war, doesn't even go out to the battlefield, and they do not have to help the war effort at all, because the whole point is that they should be home, enjoy their fruit, enjoy their new marriage. And if they're busy providing water and food, then they're not going to be. So who has to provide water and food? Only someone who's waiting to get married. He only got engaged, so he has time to help with the war effort, and he doesn't go to war because we don't want him to be killed, because then he won't experience the joy of marriage. But this person, he just got married, so he is experiencing the joy of marriage. He shouldn't be busy with anything else. That is the Mishnah. גמרא, תנו רבנן, ודיברו השוטרים, יכול דברים של עצמן, כשהוא אומר ויאספו השוטרים, הרי דברים של עצמן, אמור, המה אני מקיים דיברו השוטרים, בדברי משוח מלחמה הכתוב מדבר. So we're noticing that in the Pesukim, let's look at them inside. It says here, first it says the Kohen will speak to them, in the Gasha Kohen. Then it says V'dibiru HaShoterim, and they give the three exemptions, 4 milestones. And then it says V'yasefu HaShoterim ledaber. Now, if I had this alone, it would sound like then the Shoterim are adding to what someone else said, right? What's the reason? Why would it say the Shoterim say 3 things, and then the Shoterim say 1 thing? If the Shoterim are saying all of it, just put them all 4 in the same list. It sounds from the Yasuva Shoterim that the part before was said by a different person, right? The Shoterim will add to what someone before said. Sounds like the Kohen. So why are there 3 different categories here? Alright, so to see it inside, so the shoterim, can it be their own words? It says yasva shoterim, so only the 3rd category is their own words. So what does it mean in the second category, shofetim? It means that they are repeating the words of the mashuach milchama. Hakesad, how does that work? Kohen medaber v'shoter mashmiya. The Kohen would say it first, in an undertone, regular, and then the officer would say it loud so everyone can hear. Interestingly, similar to the choreography of the rabbinic shiur, where the rabbi is sitting and saying it quietly, and the meturgeman or the amorah is saying it loudly. So this is a similar choreography. And this will help explain the following 3 baraitot. Taneh hada, kohen medaber v'shoter mashmiya, v'tanya idach, kohen medaber v'kohen mashmiya, v'tanya idach, shoter medaber v'shoter mashmiya. Amar Abaye, hakesad, mi nigash v'ad diberu, kohen medaber v'kohen mashmiya, mi diberu v'ad yasefu, kohen medaber v'shoter mashmiya, mi yasefu v'elach, shoter medaber v'shoter mashmiya. We have 3 different baraitot. They each say different things. The first baraita said the kohen speaks, and the officer says it louder. The second baraita says the kohen first speaks, and another kohen will, or the same kohen will say it louder. Sounds like it has to be a different kohen. It wouldn't make sense for the same kohen to say it twice. And the third one says that the officer speaks and the officer says it loud. So what's going on here? Abaye explains for the first paragraph of when it says Nigash, the kohen will come and speak and say, don't be afraid. That's talking about the kohen is the only one that speaks and amplifies. From the second paragraph, Dibiru Tayasefu, with the 3 exemptions, the Kohen first says it, and then the officer amplifies. And the last section, it's only the officers speaking. One will say it quietly, and the other one will call it out in a loud voice. I guess it makes it sound more authoritative when you have it doubled in that way. Next, Mi ha'ish asher bana bayit hadash v'chule. Tenu Rabbanan, asher bana, en li ela asher bana. Lakach v'yarash nitan lo matana minayin. Tamud omar, mi ha'ish asher bana. Now we're going to derive what it says in the Mishnah, even though the Torah only says one who actually builds the house. So from that phrase, I might have thought only if you physically build the house on your own. What if you buy it or inherit it, or get it as a present? That's why the pasuk says mi ha'ish asher bana. It doesn't just say asher bana. It uses expanded phrase, anyone, mi ha'ish. And so that expanded formula comes to include someone who receives it. Bayit, enli ela bayit. Now, it says the word bayit. I would think that means the house that the people dwell in. Minan rabot beta tevenu beta bakar beta simu beta osarot. How do I know that we should include, as the Mishnah did include, a silo or a barn or a woodshed or a warehouse? Tamod omar asher bana mikom makom. The extra word, and that asher, any that he built. So it means any type. So maybe I should include any structure that one builds, because it says asher bana. Asher bana is anything I build. So even if I build a gateway or a veranda or a balcony, Talmud Omar bayit. The other pasuk says bayit. So they're in tension with each other, and we resolve the tension. Ma bayit hara'ui l'dira, af kol hara'ui l'dira. Has to be a home that is fitting to live. Even if I'm not living there, but I'm putting my animals there, or I could, if my wife kicks me out of the house, I could go live in the silo. So these are fit to live in. That's called it would bring an exemption. Whereas an outside porch or just a gateway is not something that anyone could live in, and therefore, just because you built it, you might be excited about your new veranda, but that will not trigger an exemption. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disagrees with the Braita above. He says Bait means literally a house, a regular house that people live in. That's the only thing that allows for an exemption, and not a barn or a warehouse or a silo. Good. Lo chanach velo chanacho. Perat legazlan. Now the pasuk has a limiting phrase. It doesn't just say who has not dedicated. It says who has not dedicated it. So it is limiting a pronoun that comes to exclude a thief. If someone steals a house, then he does not get exempt. Oh, I just stole a house and I didn't get a chance to live in it yet. No, you don't get an exemption when you stole a house. Now, lema delak Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Te'i Rabbi Yosef HaGalili ha'amar v'racha lebav. Zeh hamityareh me'averot shebeyado. It seems that the opinion that said that lo chanacho is coming to exclude a thief is not the opinion of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, because Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, when he said regarding the fourth exemption of someone who was afraid and faint-hearted, he said that doesn't refer only to someone who just doesn't have courage and they're afraid of dying. We don't want that person in the war. He's going to ruin the morale for everyone else. Rather, Rabbi Yosef says that this is referring to someone who has sins, and because he has sins, he's afraid that because of his sins, he's going to be punished and die in war. And so that person has an exemption. A sinner is exempt from going to war. Now, since this guy is a thief, he would already be exempt from the fourth exemption as a sinner. And so you wouldn't need the word chanacha to exempt him because he stole a house. So it seems that this baraita is not the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Galili, who has a different exemption for such a thief sinner. And we answer, afilu tema Rabbi Yosef Galili. We don't want this baraita to be only according to one person and not another. We could explain that it's universal. Kigon da'avat teshuvah v'havdemeh. It is a sinner, a thief, but he made teshuvah and he went to the person that he stole it from and he said, "Here, I'm going to pay you," and he pays the original. If he owes a fine, he pays a fine. And he made teshuvah, and so now he paid for it. Therefore, he's not a sinner anymore, although he actually got it as a thief. Wait a second. Now we say if he went and paid the original owner for it, so now he's a purchaser, and someone who buys a new house has an exemption until he gets to live in it, and the first year that he lives in it, he does have an exemption. So this thief, repentant thief, should get an exemption. Lihadad, let him come back from war. And the answer is no, because originally he got it through robbery, so now he does not get an exemption, even though he made teshuvah in between, so he's no longer a sinner, so he's not going to get the fourth exemption. Nevertheless, and even though now he paid for it and got it legally, but this Rabbi Yosef Galili will explain that this chanacho, excluding a gazlan, comes to exclude not only a sinner, but even some thief who made teshuvah, because he originally got it by stealing, even though later on he paid for it, he doesn't get to enjoy the exemption from war. And next, Umia ish asher nata kerem bechole tenor banan asher nata en li ela nata lakach veyarash v'nitan lo b'matana minayin tamodomar hamia ish asher nata. So when it says a person who planted, so if it just said, the Braita says, if it just said planted, I would know only someone who planted it. How do I know to include someone who bought it or inherited or got it as a present, which the Mishnah does include? So we explain, it says from the expanded phrase, Umiha ish, who is the person who planted? So that extra Umiha ish comes to include receiving it in any way is also exempt. Kerem, enli ella kerem minan rabot chamisha ilene machav afilu mishar minin. How do we know that we should include not only a vineyard, but also an orchard of 5 fruit trees? even if there are different species, Tamud Lamad Asher Nata, because the Kedem says that was planted. So that was planted, that's a more general phrase, including other trees. So maybe if it says Ata, maybe it means anything that I plant, even if it's 4 or less fruit trees, or 5 or more non-fruit trees. That's why it says Kedem. It has to be similar to a vineyard in that it produces fruit and a substantial amount of fruit. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Kedem kemashmaor. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disagrees and says, I'm not expanding it. Kedem is vineyard. Vineyard means vineyard. That's all. Just like before, Rabbi Eliezer is the same one that said house means house, not a barn. So too, vineyard means a vineyard and not any other trees. Now, lo chilel velo chilelo, from the extra pronoun here of someone who did not redeem or use it. It says, it doesn't say just not redeem the fruit, but redeem it. Why the extra pronoun? Perat lemavrich ul markiv. This comes to exclude someone who layers or grafts. That if you grafted a new tree or layered a new tree, you are not exempt from going to war. That's not considered like planting. It's not considered a new tree, according to this baraita. Now we ask, our Mishnah included the grafter and the person who layers in the exemption. And this baraita says he's not included in the exemption. By the way, it's not clear in this baraita whether the lo chilo perat mavrich markiv is that the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, or is it a new section? We will see more about that. So we have a big problem here. We're going to see a few different answers to this question. A contradiction between the Mishnah, which says that they are exempt, the grafter, and the Braita, which says the grafter is not exempt. So, Amar Bizera Amar Chistar La Kashya. Kan Bahar Kavat Isur, Kan Bahar Kavat Teter. So, Rav Bizera gives the first answer and says, when you're grafting in a prohibited way, one species onto another, then you do not get exempt. That's what the Braita was talking about. You see, this is assuming that this could be according to everybody, not only Rabbi Eliezer. Whereas the Mishnah that says it's allowed, that he does get exempt, that's when you are doing a permitted grafting. The same species, you just want to have like a bigger fruit on a host that gives smaller fruit. That's okay, that's permitted, and that is called an exemption. That's considered enough of a new planting that you're looking really forward to that new fruit that's coming from it. And now we ask, what is the case of the grafting in the permitted case? If the host tree is a new tree and the graft is also a new tree, then why do you need the grafting? The person would be exempt just because of the host. If the host is a new tree that he didn't get to enjoy its fruit, then he'd be exempt because of that tree. So you don't have to add a case of grafting. So rather it must be that the host tree is already old. It's already more than 4 years old, and he enjoyed the fruit of that tree. And the grafting is because he's grafting a new a branch from a new tree that he has not yet enjoyed. Must be that's the case, right? But that also doesn't work. In a case of orla, we're going to be comparing the case of exemption from war with the case of orla because they actually go hand in hand. Something is called a new tree as long as you didn't benefit from it, and you can't benefit from it during the 3 years of orla until the 4th year when you redeem the fruit. So Rabbi Abhu regarding orla said, if you take a new branch and you connect it with an old tree, a tree that is already past orla, then the new is batel with the old, and there's no din of orla. You could eat that fruit right away. In other words, we go by the status of the host tree, and if the host tree is already past 4 years, then putting a new branch, you could eat that fruit that grows from it right away. What we see from here is that we go by the host, and therefore for exemptions also, we should say this person is not exempt because we go by the host, and the host, he already enjoyed the fruit of the host tree, and so this extra graft that he's putting in there does not, it becomes batel and takes on the same status as the host, and so there should be no exemption. But this, we're looking for a case of the Mishnah where it's a permitted grafting and they are exempt. So it can't be a new host, it can't be an old host. So what case can it be? אמר רבי ירמיה לעולם ילדה בילדה כגון דנטה להחכמייתא לסייג ולקורות דתנן הנוטע לסייג ולקורות patur min ha'orla. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I'll explain this, talking about, in fact, a young shoot on a young tree. And what you asked about, well, then you'd be exempt from because of the young host. No, the young host, I originally planted it as a fence or as a beam. In other words, I planted this tree to be hedges on the edge of my property to act like a fence, or I planted it not for the fruit, but rather for the wood. I want to cut it down and use it for beams. And we have a Mishnah in Orla that teaches that if I plant something just as not for its fruit, but rather as a hedge or for its beams, I don't have to follow the law of Orla. Orla is only when I have in mind that I'm going to use the fruit. Then the fruit is prohibited for the first 3 years. But if I have in mind that it's not going to be for fruit, then the Orla is permitted. And the same would be true here for the case of being for exemption. If I planted this tree for hedges or for the wood, then I'm not exempt from it to go to war because I don't care about the fruit. That was not my intention for the fruit, so I'm not exempt. But if I take a new branch and I graft it, and I have in mind that whatever grows from that new branch, that will be for fruit, so then I'm exempt because that follows the branch. That's the case that we're talking about in the Mishnah when it says a graft does create an exemption. And now we ask, what's the difference between the two cases we just mentioned? If you put a new graft into an old tree, a tree that I planted for fruit, but now it's past 4 years, and there you said the new graft is negated and we follow the host, and therefore the host I don't get an exemption for, so I don't get an exemption for the graft either. And in this case where you don't say that it's negated, even though the host tree I get no exemption for because I planted it just for wood. And yet here, when I put in the new branch, I don't say that it's negated by the status of the host. How come in the first case it's negated, in the second case it's not batel? And the answer is, Hatam imim lichala lav bat mihadar hi, hacha imim lichal ala bat mihadar hi. The answer, in the case of the old tree, even if I change my mind, there's no way I can make it young again. I'm exempt no matter what, right? Once a tree is past the 4 years and I enjoyed the fruit, then no matter what I think, it's always going to be an old tree. So that has a permanent status. In that case, that permanent status of the old tree, which does not give me an exemption, because it's permanent, is stronger than the graft, and the graft is batel. Whereas in the case of a tree that I planted for a hedge or for wood, let's say at first I decided it's going to be for that, I get no exemption. What if I change my mind in the middle? If I change my mind in the middle, then I do get an exemption. And in parallel, it will become prohibited as orla. So you see that it's a temporary status, more changeable. Because of that, it's weaker. And because it has a weaker status, because I could always change my mind, therefore, even if I don't change my mind, but I put a graft in it, and now I have in mind the graft, it will be for fruit, well then the graft takes on a status of a new tree and will exempt me from going to war, right? And the reason why changing my mind is effective is because trees generally, by default, are in fact for fruit. I'm just a weirdo that I'm planting a tree for the wood. And that's the same law as a tree that grows on its own, right? Tree, I didn't plant it, but some pit fell there and it grew on its own. I still have to, I'm still prohibited by orla, even though I didn't consciously plant it. So you see the default state of fruit trees is for fruit, and therefore, even if I have in mind that it's not going to be for fruit, I can always change my mind and it will regain its original status. So therefore, its status as a fruit tree always remains in abeyance, and that's why even if I don't change my mind, but I put in the graft, the host will not negate the status of the graft. The graft has its own status and is considered like a new fruit tree and therefore is exempt, and that's the difference between the two. Good. Now the Gemara asks, "Velokma becherem shel shene shutafin, dahai hadad adideh, v'hai hadad adideh." You just gave me a very complicated case. Why don't you say a simpler case of where there's a permitted graft? That's what we're looking for, and yet the new graft is not batel to the old. You can find such a case where you have two people that are now in partnership. One person owns the host tree. Let's say it's a new tree. Fine. And there's another person that comes with the grafting branch that he owns. And they're going to join together and they put it in. So in that case, both of them can be exempt. One will be exempt because he owns the host tree and the host tree is new and didn't have fruit yet. And the other one, he'll be exempt also because he contributed the graft. So, and now they were owned separately. And so that's why the one who brought the graft is not going to be exempt because of the host tree. You don't say it's batel. If he owns everything, then as we said before, we have the problem that it's going to be batel. But since they were owned by two different people, and so then the original guy, then the person bringing the graft, for him, this is a new planting. And so that is the case that the Mishnah is coming to include. So why don't we say that simpler case? The Papa says we learn from here that if you have a vineyard or a tree that's owned by two people jointly, neither of them gets an exemption from war. The idea is that you're very excited when you're the sole owner, but when already you're sharing the business venture with someone else, so then you're sharing the happiness too. It's not as much of a milestone. Maybe that's the reason. Anyway, partnerships do not give an exemption, and here, well, since they're coming together, and now the new tree plus graft, it's all one unit, is jointly owned. So in fact, they will the grafter, the person who owned the graft, will not get an exemption, and that's why this case is no good. That's why we didn't say it. Now, question about that, about the partnership law. There's another law that if you have 5 brothers and they all went out to war and one of them dies and without children, so then all of the other ones have to come back from war. Even though only one of them is going to do yibum, but they all have an equal opportunity to do yibum. I mean, it should be the older one, but any one of them can do it, and they all go back. So in a way, that's also a partnership, right? These 4 surviving brothers each have a share or an opportunity to do yibum, so they're all and have a zikah, somewhat like engaged to the yevama, and that they all come back. So how come? Why don't we say the same thing? That if you have a vineyard that's jointly owned, that they didn't get fruit yet, that they should all be exempt. And the answer is hatam kol chad vechad karina be ishto, hacha kol chad vechad la karinan be karmo. In the case of yibum, for each one of the brothers, there's a potential that if they do yibum, he will be the sole husband of Ishto, says Ishto. And so even though we're not sure who is going to be the one to end up doing it, 3 of them will be out, totally have no relationship, actually be erva to them, and one of them will be fully married to the woman. And so therefore, one of them will be totally Ishto, and therefore all of them have a potential to be that one guy. They all come back. Whereas if you have joint ownership of a vineyard, it doesn't fully belong to anyone. You can't say this is his vineyard or his vineyard because it's only half his vineyard, and so that word karmot does not apply. Good. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar. Now, all that was one answer. The question was, we had a Mishnah that said a grafter is exempt, and it's like a new tree, and we have a Braita that said it's not exempt. So our first answer was, we're talking about if it's prohibited graft of different species, then it's not. Then you don't get an exemption. Just like you don't get exemption for other prohibitions of prohibited marriage. But if it's a permitted graft, then you get an exemption. That was all one answer. Now a second answer. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar, "B'mavrich ilan beyarak." והייתנהו דתניא המבריך אילן בירק רבן שמעון בן גמליאל מתיר משום רבי יהודה בן גמדה איש כפר עכו וחכמים אוסרים. We're talking about a case where one grafts a tree onto a vegetable. And so in this case, because you're putting a tree with a vegetable, this is considered like a new tree. It's similar to taking a tree branch and putting it in the ground because they're so different from each other. So therefore, this is now going to produce, I don't know what it's going to produce, some kind of combination, right? But this is considered new enough that the person will be exempt from more. Now, this answer will only be valid for the following Tana, who says it's permitted in terms of kilayim to graft these two things together. Because even according to this answer, you still Mishnah is only assuming a permitted case, that you only get exempt if you do something permitted. And in fact, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that you're permitted. It's not two different species of fruits you're not allowed, but fruit grafted with a vegetable, he says, is permitted. And so that answer would be valid according to them, even though Chachamim prohibit, so this answer would not be good according to Chachamim. And then we have a last answer to the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Braita. Ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael and said, reported the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Ha maneh, who is the author of this entire Braita? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, we saw that the beginning of the Braita says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and the continuation also is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He is more stringent. He says that grafting is not included at all. So he disagrees with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is according to the majority of Chachamim that say grafting is similar enough to planting. And so, in fact, the Mishnah does contradict the Braita because the Braita is a minority opinion. All right, and then after all, we know that he would say that Lo amar Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov hatam kerem kemashmao hachaname nata kemashmao noteain mavrich markib la. In that very same Braita, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is quoted by name and saying kerem means vineyard only, not other trees. And so, when you say planting, it means literally planting and not grafting and not layering. So first, it wouldn't apply to trees anyway. But if you wanted to layer vines, then also that would not apply. That's not considered a new vine. It's just an extension of an old vine. And so that is an easy way, a clear way to resolve it doesn't resolve the contradiction. It notes that Braita doesn't have to be resolved because it's the opinion of the well-known opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Now that we mentioned one halacha by Rav Dimi, named Rabbi Yochanan, about Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, we're going to continue and give a few more halachot, also from Rabbi Yochanan, and this one in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov as well. Yalda pechuta mitefach, chayevet be'ola kol shenoteha demitchazya kebat shata. If you have a vine that is less than a tefach tall, it doesn't grow very much. Usually they grow higher, but it's like a bonsai vine, and it stays that way. It's liable to orla all its years. Usually orla is only the first 3 years, but this is going to have orla status forever. It's going to be prohibited. Why? Because of marit ayin. People will look and say, oh, look how small that is. It must be within the first 3 years. And then they're going to see you taking its grapes and eating them. You say, oh, they're violating. And so therefore, its smallness makes it have the same status as if it was yalda. Right? Yalda means it's young. This is actually, even after it's old, it's considered like it's young. But this prohibition is only true, this stringency, if there's only a few vines. But if you have a lot of vines, if you have the whole vineyard is full of them, then there'll be publicity. Everybody will know, hey, look, it's been 3 years and look, it's still not growing. Oh, I guess that's some kind of species of vineyard vines that they are not growing taller than that. And so then everybody knows that 3 years passed and there's no problem of marit ayin. So what is the definition of the whole thing? So commentaries say at least 3 by 3, 3 vines in 3 rows, but not smaller than that. An example of smaller than that is 2 by 2 with 1 coming out. This would look like, think of a number 5 on dice, except the middle dot, move it outside of the square. So if it's only that, it is that would be chayav in orla, and if it's short, it'll be chayav in orla forever. But if there's a lot, then everybody will know, and there's no problem with marit ayin. Yet another halacha with the same attribution. Met tofes arba amot likiryat shema dichtib loeg larash cheref osehu. One is not permitted to recite Shema or do other mitzvot in front of a corpse, because Pasuk says, whoever mocks the poor blasphemes his maker. And this poor guy who is deceased, he's poor because he cannot do mitzvot anymore. So you're going and saying Shema, fulfilling the commandment of saying Shema in front of him. It's kind of mocking him. Haha, you can't say Shema anymore because you're dead. I can, I'm alive. And so that halacha applies right in front of the deceased, and that includes 4 amot all around the body. So not just if you're actually on top of it, but even 4 amot surrounding it. Next halacha also, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, a little bit different. It's not Avdimi, it's Rabbi Yitzchak instead, but the rest of it is the same. Choragta hagedela ben ha'achin, asura linaseh la'achin, timit chazyaki achtaihu, velahi kala itle lemileta. So the original halacha says that if you have a stepdaughter who grows up in the family among brothers from a different marriage, so although from the letter of the law they are not related, and therefore there wouldn't be a problem of them getting married, nevertheless, Rabbi Yaakov taught that they are prohibited because they they appear like siblings. They grew up together. They're always around together. They go on trips together. They act as a family, and therefore it's like they're related. And it looks like they're related. That was the original halacha. The Gemara comments, however, and says it's not so because there's publicity. Everybody knows. Oh, that she had a child from a different marriage, and he had children, and then they married, and these are just stepbrothers or stepsisters, and therefore they are not related. And since everybody knows they're not related, it will not be a problem of marit ayin, according to the Gemara's commentary. V'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, v'amar Rabbi Yochanan, mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, lechet shechichau pe'ah she'asa'an bagoren hukbe'u lema'aser. The same traditions taught that if someone, you have a poor person who takes leket, that's a forgotten stalk, or shechicha, a forgotten whole sheaf, pe'ah, he takes from the corner, he's permitted to. He's a poor person, and he gathers so much of this, like a shecham pe'ah, that he actually makes a pile out of it and stores it away. Now, the general halacha regarding regular produce that a person owns is he's chayav to bring maaser. At what point? Not while he's still preparing it, but rather when he finishes processing and he stores it, puts it in a pile, smooths out the pile, and it's ready for storage for the rest of the season. That's when he has to take maaser, but not before that. So now, a poor person who takes leket shecha pe'ah does not have to give maaser. He takes whatever he takes home, and he can just eat it. You only have to give maaser if you own it, not if you're the poor person. However, in this case, because this poor person gathered so much that he was able to get a pile, and he smoothed out the pile, people looking at him will not know that he's a poor person that got this from leket shecha pe'ah. They will think, oh, he's a farmer, and he finished it off, and they're going to see that he's eating from it without taking maaser. Therefore, he has to take maaser. Amarula lo amaran ela besadeh aval ba'ir kala itle lemileta. And again, like the others before, we limit it, and we say that's only if it's out in the field. The poor person's out in the field, and he gathers it somewhere. But if he brings it into the city, then everybody talks to each other in the city, and it will stand out, and people will will know, oh, look at this poor person. Look how he was able to gather so much, and he made a pile out of it. And so they will not think that he's eating it and violating maaser. He actually doesn't have to take maaser. And finally, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Yalda pechuta mitefach, ena mekadeshet et hazeraim. This is a law of kilayim. You can't plant vines next to various other species of vegetables. However, some of those vegetables will be prohibited mideoraita as kilayim, and some of them are only prohibited midirabanan. So regarding those, that you can't plant vines next to those vegetables, and it's only the Rabbanan, Rabbi ben Yaakov has a leniency and says that if those vines are very small, less than a tefach tall, then the Rabbanan are not going to apply that gezerah, and you don't have to worry about them. They do not become prohibited. However, that's only if it's a little bit, same as before, two and one emerging. Then that's when the statement of leniency applies. But if it's the whole vineyard, then even though it's short, that's pretty significant. And in that case, these other, if it's planted together with those other vegetables, it in fact will be forbidden. There's one more statement, but we'll leave that for the next daf. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.